Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Where is all of the research data? Opportunities for libraries in the Portage Network to improve the discovery of Canadian research data. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. As you may have noticed, you've been automatically muted when you entered the room. This webinar is being recorded and the chat may be archived for those who are unable to attend today. We encourage everyone to use the latest version of Zoom so that you have access to all of the features, including the latest security updates. We encourage everyone to use the chat feature if you are having any technical difficulties or if you have additional resources to share. We encourage you to use the Q&A button, which you'll find in the Zoom features, if you have any questions to ask of the presenter. We're going to be addressing questions at the end. You can also raise your hand if you wish to ask a question out loud if you feel that it needs additional clarification. Questions may be asked in English or French. You can find the complete code of conduct at the following URL that will be just dropped into the chat in just a moment. We want to let everyone know that CARL is committed to providing a welcoming, safe, and harassment-free environment for its staff, membership, committees, and working groups, as well as for participants, speakers, and organizers of CARL meetings and events. We do not tolerate harassment of any kind. Today's presenter is Kevin Reed. In this webinar, Kevin will be sharing information about an ongoing research project designed to identify how and where Canadian-funded research data is shared by examining the scholarly literature and highlight data management problems associated with these existing data sharing practices. Kevin Reed is a librarian at the University of Saskatchewan and chair of the Portage Network's Data Discovery Expert Group. For the past 8 years, he has worked in data management and sharing roles at the U.S. National Library of Medicine and NYU School of Medicine, and developed collaborative projects with other libraries to establish data discovery services. He is happy to be home in Canada, where he can contribute to ongoing national data efforts. I'm going to hand things over to Kevin now.
Okay, can you hear me, Melanie? Okay.
Yep, we can hear you.
Great.
You just want to share your slides now.
Yeah, it's telling me I can't.
Oh, try now.
There we go. Okay. We're good?
That's great. Thanks, Kevin.
Perfect. Okay, so hi everyone, and thank you for coming. Today I'm going to be talking about where's all the research data and opportunities for libraries in Portage to improve the discovery of Canadian research data. As Melanie mentioned, I'm currently a health sciences librarian at the University of Saskatchewan, and I've been working in different data discovery roles for the past 8 years. And I really bring up this slide because I think that the idea of making data more discoverable, especially regardless of where it has been stored, has really been following me throughout my whole career. And this was really the impetus, not only for the research project I'm going to talk to you about today, but also just in general about how to improve data discovery overall in Canada. So the plan today is to introduce a research project that we designed to locate Canadian research data, to identify challenges associated with improving the discovery of Canadian research data. Then what I'm hoping to do for the second half of this talk is really engage with you all in a discussion about strategies that libraries can use to improve the discovery of Canadian research data, as well as to think about Portage's role in making research data in Canada more discoverable. So I've only been back in Canada for about 8 months now. I started my position in September of last year. But while I was in the States, I saw the research data management policy, and really this was the catalyst for me to think about a lot of questions surrounding how this policy would be implemented and how it would be tracked and how researchers would be impacted by it. So we know that the policy recognizes data as an important facet of scholarly research. And we know that it requires data management plans and that there's an element of data deposit to this policy. But what I really wanted to hone in on today is what they mention about in data deposit. And really that's to focus on how all research data, metadata, and code that directly support research conclusions, and I want to focus on that specifically, needs to be available or shared in some way, shape, or form. And that's what I want to address today. Then, in February of this year, we saw even further motivation that may impact the way researchers do their work and how they share. And this is the idea of a roadmap for open science that is going to recognize data as an open science output, and we're going to require to be implementing FAIR principles, and the data strategy roadmap that was used to build the tri-agency policy is going to be aligned with this open science action plan. So what this made me think about was, how is all of this effort going to impact researchers, and what have researchers already been doing to match what is going to be asked of them coming down the pipe? So the questions that arose from this for me was, how have tri-agency funded researchers shared their data in the past, if at all? Where can you find tri-agency funded research data now, if anywhere? And how well have researchers utilized RDM best practices when sharing their data? And ultimately, the reason I was thinking about these questions was all because I wanted to think about how prepared are researchers to actually adopt these new policies. I think many of us on the call probably know the answer to this question, but I wanted to see with evidence what the data sharing landscape looks like currently to make better informed decisions about how to improve this going forward. So the research project we looked at, I'm a health sciences librarian, so my focus was on documenting how and where CIHR specifically funded researchers share their data, and compare the researchers who share their data to current data practices to the proposed framework. So how well is what researchers are doing right now matched to what the tri-agency wants them to do? So that was one of my main focuses. And I have a great research team working with me: Heather Ganshorn at the University of Calgary, David Scott at the University of Lethbridge, and Sarah Rutley at the University of Saskatchewan have been instrumental in bringing this project to light as we continue to work on it today. So what we did to figure out the full scope of data sharing from CIHR funded researchers is we went to PubMed first, and we searched for all articles that were A, CIHR funded, and B, indicated that their data was shared in a repository. So you can do this because some of the metadata filters in PubMed allow you to search for something called the secondary source identifier, which indicates when data has been shared in a specific repository. To complement this particular bit of information, we also looked at PubMed Central, which is really the open access database for biomedical research, whereas PubMed is a more closed off database with over 30 million biomedical citations. And what we did there was we extracted, again, all articles that were CIHR funded. But the nice thing about PubMed Central is you can find articles that have included a data availability statement. So authors have written a statement indicating how and where their data is being shared. So by looking at and pulling out articles from both of these databases, we were able to find about 5,000 articles total. There's some overlap over the two databases, and we focused on pulling as many duplicates into the PubMed Central side of things because there's more rich metadata there than there is in PubMed. So this left us with about 5,000 articles where there was some example of data sharing being done that was CIHR funded. From there, we pulled a lot of different metadata from these articles, which included the journal the articles were published in, the publication type, the type of grant funding they received, whether or not they had a data availability statement, the repository where they deposited their data. We also included the acknowledgements because often authors will actually indicate where they shared their data in the acknowledgements rather than in a data availability statement or in the article itself. And then we pulled out some of the keywords and major topic headings to see if there were certain trends in different disciplines of who was sharing more and who was sharing less. So ultimately what we did was we took the CIHR funded article and we pulled all the metadata from it as well. And we asked the following questions: how and where are the data shared, if anywhere? Are researchers' data availability statements actually informative and tell us how to gain access to their data? And what documentation did researchers share in addition to the research data itself? So thinking about research data management, were they making their data meaningful by including documentation that would help us understand it? So what we found so far from this study, and for the purpose of this webinar, We reviewed a random sample of our 5,000 articles to look at 354. And in general, we found that data sharing methods are very varied and inconsistent. The data availability statements are pretty unclear for the most part. The included documentation alongside the data is limited beyond the common tables and figures you would see within an article. And surprisingly for us was, even though we were isolating to articles that were supposed to have indicated their data was shared, we found that 55% of what we found didn't share data at all. So what I'm going to do now is break this down into a number of different components that will help drive the discussion for later on in the session. So this is a breakdown of the data sharing status that we looked at, grouped into 4 main categories. As I just mentioned, of the 354 articles, 195 of them didn't share any data whatsoever. And this is important because a lot of these articles were randomized control trials and clinical trials where there are high levels of evidence where you think at least the availability of data would be there to access it. But in this case, we couldn't find any data or any mention of how you would gain access to the data for that article. We then looked at data that was accessible, and we defined this by the fact that we could actually go and retrieve the data. We could grab it and hold it and look at it in our hands. Whereas data that was said to be available, this is authors that said their data was available, for example, by request. And then finally, data sharing was not applicable or possible, and we categorized them this way if the authors provided reasons for why they didn't share. So you can see here a slow breakdown of the different ways that data sharing was made available here. So if we look at the data sharing methods and the way people made their data available, I'm going to go into this in a bit more detail, but you can see the highest ranked here is data being available in a repository, which is good because it means that the data is actually accessible. And then we see the long tail all the way down to people who said data will be made available at a future date. So we're seeing a real range here in how researchers are saying their data might be shared or might not be shared. And I'm going to break this down a little bit further. So first of all, looking at the specific repositories that were used, this is the breakdown of what we found. So perhaps not surprisingly, the top 3 data repositories that were used were Protein Databank, Gene Expression Omnibus, also known as GEO, and GenBank. And these are 3 of the major genomic data sharing repositories. And ever since the Human Genome Project in the early 2000s that required international researchers to share data quickly in order to complete the human genome, data sharing is really the norm in that field. So we weren't necessarily surprised to see these 3 repositories at the top of the list. However, once you get out of the genomics realm, you see this really long tail of data of different repositories that might include discipline-specific repositories, general purpose repositories like Figshare, even GitHub was included in there a few times. But what we didn't find, obviously, were institutional data repositories, and this may be because they weren't included yet and researchers weren't using them yet, but we're also just seeing that data is really distributed in a lot of different places currently. The next thing we found, which was the most prominent way for sharing, was that authors would claim that the data was either available within the written contents of the article or the data was available in the supplementary files. So pardon me for using maybe a tired meme, but when we read through any article where the authors claimed the data was available in the contents of that article, we felt a little bit suspect about what they were saying. Oftentimes because they were collecting data from patients, they were running experiments on animals, and they were summarizing data, but we're saying that all the data that you would need is in the article when we couldn't actually touch any data at all, which I think is right now a problem because a lot of authors assume that that's enough. But I think as we see this policy come out, it's going to be required of them to do a lot more than that. And then just as a comparison, authors who said you could find their data available in the supplementary files, only 3% of the articles, of those 72 articles, actually had data that we could look at and explore in the supplement. So what the authors are saying and what is the reality is pretty different in this case. And I think that's a problem that needs to be rectified. The next thing I want to talk about is this category where authors have said that the data is available but not readily accessible. And this is really going to be the jumping off point for what I want to talk about in the second half, which is authors who are willing to make their data available in a statement, but aren't providing a lot of detail as to how you would actually gain access to that data. So the two things I want to focus on here is you'll notice that I broke this chart down into authors who said their data was available upon reasonable request and authors who said their data was available upon request. And we made the distinction because the word reasonable here seemed distinct enough to include as a separate thing. We don't necessarily know what that means, but I think it's interesting that some are including that as a reasonable request and others aren't. And if we look at these type of statements that say this, we're finding there's a lot of lack of clarity and detail in these statements. So I've pulled a few examples from the articles that we found. And here you can see the statement says, the data sets used or analyzed during the study are available from the corresponding author on reasonable requests. Now, there's a lot of vague information here. First of all, I don't necessarily know what data sets they're talking about. I don't know what a reasonable request is in this case. Does it mean I need to provide a data use agreement? Does it mean I need to fill out an ethics application? Without any detail here, it's very hard for me as someone who might be interested in this data set to make a request. We're also finding that data availability statements have conflicting information. So this one says that data is available upon reasonable request, but also all the data is in the contents of the published article. So are we talking about what am I making the request for versus what's available in the article itself? And then we saw a lot of these as well, which is you can make a request for data from the author, but then at the end of this particular statement, it says that there's no data access committee to grant access to the request. So here it gives me a lot of uncertainty as to whether or not it's worth my time as a researcher to contact this person in order to gain information. And even the author in this case would have a hard time because they're going to get a lot of random requests without providing a lot of structure or detail there. And I think I see that, and our group sees that as a big problem, especially in improving the discovery of Canadian data. From there, we looked at articles that said their data was available on websites. We only found 12 out of the 354, but about half of those websites that we tried to access either didn't work or didn't take us directly to the data itself, which again is probably a good justification for why DOIs are important and handles are important to keep persistent links to data. But ultimately right now, these websites aren't working very well. And what this does is really enforce a study that was done back in 2014. I'm not sure if people have seen this study by Vines and their group, but what they've said is as soon as an article is published, the data really declines in terms of usefulness and availability over time. And as we see these data availability statements and these websites being used to share data without proper recording of this information, we're automatically seeing a decline in the usefulness of this data. So I feel like what we're finding in our study matches quite well to what we've seen, what's been reported in the past in this article. I also think it's important to make the argument that just because data is restricted or licensed doesn't mean that it's not valuable. So here are examples of different types of studies where authors have indicated that their data is available upon request. And we're seeing randomized control trials and clinical trials where really valuable data where you don't want to repeat experiments on humans who've had to go through something similar, this data becomes essential. And in order to understand this data, these types of studies go through rigorous review and documentation. So some of their data management might actually be better than a lot of the data that's already open and out there. And just thinking about what the policy is stating in terms of the draft is that it's all research data and metadata and code that directly support the research conclusions. And just because data is restricted, it still reports the research conclusions or supports the research conclusions. So I believe it needs to be made discoverable, and it's important that it is. So I want to make an argument for the value of making harder to access and find research data more discoverable. And there are benefits to this and a lot of challenges, but I think it's important to think about them and to outline them together. So the benefits of this is, first of all, we'd be able to locate data that might be undiscoverable otherwise. So currently, a lot of this data is nested or buried in data availability statements in articles, but have tremendous value for the research process and support research conclusions and can still be accessed through application or by request. So how do we make that data more discoverable so people can find it and see what they need to do in order to access it? Also, by not limiting researchers to a specific platform like an institutional repository, researchers can remain platform agnostic. And then what this does is give us an opportunity to develop better standards for indexing data that's available in external repositories, on restricted hard drives through ethics applications, and also indexing research data with different access restrictions. And what this would do is give us a more complete picture of what Canadian research data really looks like in terms of the sharing process. So this little diagram I've drafted on the right-hand side shows this pipeline idea of pulling data from institutional repositories, pulling data from external repositories, and making sure that that licensed and restricted data is also discoverable. So we know exactly what's available and out there, and we let the researchers decide whether or not data is going to be valuable to them, whether it's restricted or not. So the challenges with this is that this is really hard to do. How do you track data that might be in many different places? It might be in an external repository, it might be in a researcher's drawer. And what this would require is either libraries or Portage to constantly monitor researchers and data in a certain way to make sure that what we have discoverable and displayed is accurate. But I think it also requires that we develop a closer connection with research communities who place restrictions on their data. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's a really good thing, and something libraries should be thinking about more is how do we have that close connection to make sure we're matching and releasing data that researchers may care about and have worked hard on collecting, but haven't thought about how to make more discoverable. It also would require that we have stronger relationships with repositories, which I think the Portage Network is already doing really well, and improved APIs to pull data from those databases like GenBank or Figshare as well. So this is where I want to bring up the first poll. I've made a case for making research data discoverable, and I want to see whether or not you see value in making research data that is not easily accessible. So licensed data, restricted data, data available in external repositories, more discoverable. So if Melanie, if you could pull up that first poll, that would be helpful. And whether you say yes or no to this, I'm still going to make my case, but I think it'd be curious to know whether or not this is something that you think would be a valuable use of our time and of the Canadian data sharing landscape. Oh, and I was going to vote myself, but I can't. I guess you already know what I would say. Oh, awesome. Okay, that's great. That's not actually what I was expecting because of the challenges associated with it, but that's really a wonderful thing to see that so many of you think that this is an important facet. And I think together we can really think about strategies on how to do this and how to do this in a really effective way. So thank you for those who chimed in and who participated in the poll. So I appreciate that. So okay, perfect. So now that we've talked a little bit about the importance of doing this, the next question is, who is responsible for making this kind of research data discoverable? And how do we do it? So I'm going to make a few suggestions, and this is where I would also love to hear your thoughts. Obviously, I'm one person thinking about this, so any feedback you have as well would be really appreciated in this case. And so the first case I would make is for Portage and FRDR to take this on, because by working directly with NSERC, with CIHR and SHRC, we could funnel research data into FRDR regardless of where it lives. It could be monitored by Portage and the tri-agencies directly, and it could all be discoverable and available in FRDR. I think what this also would do is increase the sustainability measures associated with keeping FRDR alive, because it could serve as a reporting tool for all these agencies to make sure that researchers have complied with making their data discoverable and available. And even if data is restricted, it would still meet some of the FAIR principles because it could still be findable and there would be information on how to access that data. Similarly, if it's worked within FRDR, you could provide a lot more context, or at least there's the potential to provide more context. So you could have the research data stored in there. It could be tied to the DMP the researchers submitted at the beginning of their grant. It could be tied to the publication that results from the data set and any documentation that would be needed to understand the research data included in there. And FRDR has the potential and the capacity potentially to do this. And I know there are people on the call who work closely with FRDR, and obviously I'm curious to hear your thoughts about this as well. But as a national federated data research repository, I see the value there. And then from there, the benefit to this is by working with the tri-agencies, they could feed the data into FRDR, and with FRDR's existing relationship with OpenAIR to actually feed all of these data records into institutions and institutional libraries, catalogs or summons or primos. This is a nice pipeline of making sure that every library across the country could see all the data regardless of where it's stored. And I think that's a really important facet of making sure that this type of data is discoverable and available. On the other hand, I also see value in the case for libraries to do this and to expand their role beyond what they're doing already with research data management. So imagine a researcher goes through some institutional workflow where they apply for ethics approval and work with IT, and they decide to share or restrict access to their data depending on the sensitivity of that data. Well, at the same time as doing that, they could work with a library, or a library could be integrated into that workflow where they index that data regardless of where it's stored. So because libraries have such a close connection to their own research communities at each individual institution, we could be the stakeholders or the custodians of where that data lives, regardless of whether it's in an external repository, in our institutional data sources, or it's restricted behind a firewall that needs ethics approval. And then once that's completed, it could then be piped into FRDR. So this is the opposite end of things, where librarians are responsible for their research data, and then it can be fed, working closely with Portage to make sure that data gets fed in, just as they're already doing with our institutional data repositories. So that's another idea that I thought about around that. So thinking about what this would take from a library perspective, for those of you who are librarians on the call, we'll bring up the second poll now. In its current state of your library, would your library have the ability to track all of the research data shared by your research community, regardless of where it's stored? Would you have the capacity to do something like that? So let's take a second. I also know how I would answer this question. Oh, and Melanie allowed me to vote, so that's good. So I'm going to. So we'll just wait a second for everyone to put in their feedback. I'm excited to see the results of this one. I think we'll just give another minute. Okay, just as I thought, yes. So I also answered no to this question because I think what this takes is not only a library effort, but it's a concerted collaborative effort across the institution. And you need dedicated people working on this in order to make sure that they can track and keep account and develop relationships with researchers around these data sharing practices. So thank you for responding to that as well. Okay, so I just wanted to bring up a real world example of libraries that are already doing this. And I'm a little bit biased because this is a project that I led previously in the US. And what it is 9 libraries working together in a data discovery collaboration focused solely on indexing research data that would not be discoverable through any other method. So if you look at the example here on the right-hand side, this is a data set that the 2 authors listed there are currently working on in the process of publication. So they haven't even published their data yet, but what they were interested in doing was releasing information about the data in order to find new collaborators to do research with. So you'll notice here what the effort focuses on in this particular initiative is to develop accessibility metadata where it could be accessed through an administrator in that researcher's office. There's detailed restrictions on who can access it and how, and there's instructions on how to do that. And so all 9 of these libraries are using the same system to unearth this data that would previously be undiscoverable otherwise. And I think this is something that would be really valuable, not only for researchers to find out whether or not their data might be valuable to somebody else, but also just in general to improve the discovery of their data so it can be found by other people and requested, and new research can be done on it moving forward. So I still want to go back to the idea and just remind us again about the policy guidance, in that we're talking about all digital research data that support research conclusions. So I do not think that licensed or restricted data in this case excludes themselves from being part of the data sharing process. And I think we need to think about how we do this effectively. So now that we've talked a little bit about who should be responsible, what this would actually look like, I want to bring up my last poll, which is to ask you who should be responsible for tracking the whereabouts of Canadian research data. I know I'm invested in the idea of libraries and Portage working together, but I also included some other groups in case you think the responsibility should lie elsewhere. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about this and take your time and think about it a little bit. But I'm excited that I get to fill out these polls too. And I'm excited to see the results of this. Because I do think this is something that could fall into many different areas, but I do feel like it is an opportunity and a great one for Portage and libraries to be working on this together. So we'll just wait another minute. Okay. Great. Yeah, and for those of you who said institutional research offices and tri-agencies, I do see value in that as well. It is their data, and they are the ones who are responsible for making policy a requirement and having teeth. So there is value in that as well. But what I ideally think would be helpful is to see all of these groups at each individual institution working together in order to do this effectively. So thank you for filling that out as well. And for those of you who put other, I would be curious to hear what you think. So if you could include that in the chat afterwards, what I'd like to do is any of the feedback we've talked about today, I'll share it in a Google Doc so we all have it as a reference moving forward. So thank you again. So the other part of this equation that we found in this study is really how do we improve the reporting of data sharing in the published literature? So I've already talked a little bit about how reporting practices are poor, but there may be a number of reasons contributing to why that is. So here we have that simple data availability statement again that says the data sets used or analyzed are available from the author on reasonable requests. And when you match this statement to the guidance that's provided by some of the big publishers like Nature, Wiley, and Taylor Francis, you can see that the authors are simply just reusing the guidance statements already provided by the publishers. But in doing so, they provide us literally no information about how to make this useful and how to actually apply for data like this. Whereas if we look at what BMJ does, they're asking authors to provide detailed information about the state of their data, who's it's available from, the contact information, any conditions of reuse, and any additional information such as documentation, protocols, statistical analysis plans. We did find, however, that when we looked at records in BMJ that had data availability statements, the authors weren't providing nearly as much detail as what was suggested by BMJ. So I think in this case, we're finding examples of bad actors on both sides. And what really needs to be done is journals need to think about requiring specific types of reporting guidelines for authors going forward. We also know from a study done last year, which I highly recommend that you read, is that the more clarity you can provide, the more sharing actually happens. So this was a study, which was a randomized controlled trial of whether or not data sharing agreements help increase researchers' willingness to share. And they found that a member of the control group is 24% more likely to share their data set should they receive a data sharing agreement. So we're seeing here clear indication that the more guidance people have and the more information they can provide, not only from the author side, but from the requester side, we're going to get more valuable sharing practices because we're going to trust who's requesting our data and we're going to understand exactly where that request is coming from. If you're at all interested, there are some template data sharing agreements included within this publication that I highly recommend you check out. They're very useful and they could be useful for teaching your researchers at your own institutions going forward. I also think it's important and incumbent on us as librarians to think about developing better accessibility metadata. So on the opposite end of the spectrum, here's a data availability statement that is extremely detailed and has a lot of nuance in it, but you would never be able to actually search this data availability statement by searching in PubMed or PubMed Central. And so if we need and we decide to make research data that's licensed or restricted more discoverable, we need to be developing accessibility metadata so that it's searchable and easier to filter by researchers. So whether that's the type of access someone can get, whether it's restricted or they need to pay for a data set, whether a data use agreement is required, what the workflow application would look like in order to gain access to the data, your restrictions for using it, and who's responsible, all should be embedded and added to any data set record where the data isn't necessarily openly available, but is accessible by request. So something to consider moving forward is how do we develop appropriate metadata to make sure that all of this detail is accounted for and searchable in any data repository or data catalog that's developed. We also, I think, in general, need to work more with authors and publishers moving forward to change the way people think about this. So making data sharing reporting the norm for authors is one thing that I think is really important. So even before they start thinking about a publication or the research process, during the data management phase even, they should be thinking about what they're going to need to develop to share their data accordingly. I think there's also the potential to work with journals to improve reporting requirements. I work in the health sciences, so the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors is, to me, the first place you would go to do this. And I think if journals start improving those requirements, we'll see more documentation that's going to be shared alongside the data set itself. And then we also, I think, need to develop a list of what's required documentation that should accompany shared data in publications. And I want to focus on this because when we looked at the articles in our study, what we found was a real lack of documentation. So commonly, you're going to see all the figures and tables that are commonly shared in an article, but beyond some of the data files, you'll see here study protocols, data collection instruments, data analysis plans, and code. Very little of it is shared over the 354 articles that we analyzed. And this is a real problem because what this brings to mind for me is the idea of this data dumpsters idea and unusable data. Whereas if we don't have meaningful data sharing, where all the documentation that makes a data set understandable is shared alongside the data, what do we do with this? What value does the data actually have? And if we think about the idea of reproducibility, especially in the sciences and the need for documentation, there's lots of evidence out there that we need to improve the transparency. And there's that great article in the middle there about how data without software are just numbers. So how do we make sure that when data sharing is completed, that all the necessary pieces of information are included and that authors instinctively think about including those as well? So that's something else I want to challenge you to think about and that hopefully we can have a discussion about at the end of this session. So one of the way I think we could improve reporting practices is incorporate data sharing reporting guidelines into existing DMP templates. So I know there is some information on data sharing right now in DMP templates, obviously, but having something specific to where an author thinks about, this is exactly what I'm going to share once I'm done with this study. And having that be explicitly required to be reported in a DMP would be essential. So just one of the ideas I've had. Of course, I'm very curious to hear more about what you think. And then just to summarize, I think what this study has told me is that it's essential that we continue to learn about our community's data sharing practices. We've learned a lot from this. I think even knowing a lot about this has helped me interact more with my research community as a whole in my liaison areas. And I ask you, for those of you who aren't in the health sciences, would similar studies of NSERC and SSHRC data sharing practices be beneficial to inform future discovery efforts? Does it make sense for us to do that? PubMed and PubMed Central give us a nice outlet to find a really big scope of what CIHR has done, whereas I know it's harder with NSERC and SSHRC, but I do think there may be value in doing that. Our work also suggests that data is really being shared through multiple methods and platforms with varying levels of access, and we need to figure out how to bring that type of data to light in order so people can find it and they know that there's a place they can go to find Canadian research data. Whether that's in our institutional catalogs or whether that's through FRDR, I don't know, but I think it's something we need to think about. Also, I think in general, by indexing research data regardless of where it's stored, it's going to improve the discovery of our research data. And finally, I think we need to think about protocols for reporting data sharing methods through those data availability statements and including necessary documentation in the workflow. So it just becomes part of the norm and part of the process for researchers going forward. So with that, I'm going to just wrap this up pretty quickly here so we can get to a little bit of discussion. I see there's some questions. If you're interested in learning more about the study that we've done, we're still working on it. The documentation and raw data that we pulled from PubMed and PubMed Central are available on Open Science Framework. And I just want to thank my team again as we continue to go through the last 4,500 articles. It's not the most painless exercise, but I think we're learning a lot in the process. So thank you, all of you who are participating. You're invaluable to making this project a reality. So I leave you with these two questions that hopefully we can talk about. How do we improve the discovery of data that is available but not immediately accessible? And what methods do you think could improve data sharing reporting practices? So thank you for your time, and thank you for Carl for having me in this webinar to present. I'm happy to take questions. You can email me at any time, but I'll put this back up so we can have a little talk and I can answer some of the questions that are available. So thank you.
Thank you very much. So our first question is from Melanie about what about data ownership issues? When you make it easily accessible, do you lock it and make it read-only? I am wondering about manipulation control or misinterpretation in secondary analysis and attribution issues.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And I think by making it discoverable, I don't necessarily mean accessible. I think what we need to think about is how do we develop records that would just be the metadata, but would provide authors or researchers with an exact pathway to get to where the data is. So the ownership would still rely on the people who collect that data, and whether they decide it's discoverable or not. The whole point is that the safety in making it discoverable is it's just the metadata. They can't see the data, they can't manipulate the data, but they can see what it's about, and it can pique their interest as to whether or not it's valuable to them, and then they can take the pathway to gain access. So whether that's working with a specific community, going through an ethics board or another review board, it just gives the chance to say, here's data that was collected and may be valuable to you. And if you want to gain access to it, you're going to have to jump through some hoops, but it's still going to be accessible if you jump through those hoops. So this way, I feel like it reduces some of that barrier. It reduces some of the risk because it's just the metadata. And that's what I'm thinking about more broadly when I think about discovery, but not necessarily accessible right away.
Thank you. And our next question is from Richard. The research presented shows that researchers are following discipline-specific approaches where well-established, very specific repositories are being well used, but everything after that is scattered. Does this mean there's a challenge where discipline norms and repositories aren't already established? And how can we have national data access with such a long tail?
Yeah, so Richard, that's a really good question. And that's where I think I'm struggling to figure out how we could do that. And part of me was thinking, is there a way through FRDR, for example, because it's the one national repository where we have, that ends up indexing the records that are available elsewhere, but you could find all of it in FRDR. So the long tail would allow us, obviously it's in multiple different places, but what we could do is feed out from those repositories through tracking, whether it's through the tri-agencies or through our institutions, and be able to find all of that data, even if it's just a record that takes you to a GenBank or to a dbGaP, for example, but you'd be able to find it in a Canadian context through a Canadian website or through a library catalog or repository. But I think overall, that's the hard part, is how do you do that in a way that's sustainable? And I think, again, it requires close monitoring, and the onus a lot of the times is on researchers to tell people that their data is in this place. So I think a lot of it is changing the way that they think about how to share. But it's an excellent question, and I don't think it has an easy solution.
Thank you. And our next question is a term clarification from Stephen. Does data equal structured data or discoverable equal accessible?
Okay, I might need, so can you say that again, Melanie, so I could wrap my head around it?
Yeah, so Stephen has written a term clarification, and Stephen, you can unmute yourself. I've given people the ability to unmute. So if you would like to clarify this question, feel free to unmute yourself. So he's written data equals structured data, or discoverable equals accessible, and both of those with a question mark.
Oh, so as two separate things?
Yes.
Okay, so basically, yeah, that's a good question. So in terms of data, yes, could we see some sort of data file, whether it was qualitative or quantitative, that we could access? And then, sorry, the second part was discoverable or accessible, sorry.
Sorry, I've popped that into the chat so you can see how it was written.
Okay, let's see, where is my chat? There we go. Okay. So discoverable, no, that's a great question. So in my case, discoverable would not necessarily mean accessible. So the way I'm thinking about this is you would be able, not readily accessible anyways. So the idea here is that you would be able to know that the data existed and what the data was included and maybe who it was collected from. But if you wanted to access that data, you may have to go through an application process, or you may have to fill out an ethical approval. So to me, the idea here is that a lot of this data still has a lot of value, but it's not easily discoverable right now at all because it's buried in articles, or maybe it's just being shared by a researcher on their lab website, for example. And I think what we need to think about, because it still supports the conclusions of their research, how do we make that discoverable so people can at least find it, and then the researcher can decide whether or not they want to take the process to gain access to that data. I hope that makes sense. Sorry for the confusion. It kind of broke my brain.
Thank you. And Stephen, if you have anything to add or any further clarification, again, you can unmute yourself and just let us know. Our next question is from Shahira. And again, Shahira, if you'd like to unmute yourself and follow up on this, feel free. The question is, what role do you think publishers have to play in this process? She shared a somewhat related article that examined researcher compliance with funder OA policies and found that compliance was related to auditing practices rather than necessarily differences between research cultures.
Okay, so related to auditing practices in the terms of the researchers being audited based on whether or not they made it OA or not? Is that what we're referring to?
Shahir, are you able to clarify? Are you still on the call? You should be able to unmute yourself. Okay, I will try to get you unmuted here. Just one second. There you go. You should be able to unmute yourself now.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yep.
we can.
Okay, hi. Thanks, Kevin. So I guess it's really two questions. My main question is what role do you think publishers have to play? And then I was also just sharing a paper by Larry Ver and Sugimoto about the role of like funding policies influencing whether like open access mandates are respected.
Yeah, so I think publishers have a big role to play, and that's in making sure that when a researcher is reporting on data sharing, that they're actually including information that is useful or valuable. And I think this is something that brought to mind. I went to an open science panel at Columbia University last year where groups from PLOS and Nature were up there who now require data availability statements. And we had asked them how many of those statements have been reviewed before something was published. And they're not at all currently. So what they're doing is Did they include a statement? Yep, check the box, it's fine. And I think we need to go a lot further than that. And it needs to be somehow tied to whether or not what a researcher provides for data sharing includes the necessary documentation to understand it. And whether that becomes part of the peer review process, which I know can be up for debate a lot. But I do think what we're seeing from a lot of these studies is that it's not sufficient information for us to figure out what's available and how to do it. And then, sorry, I lost your second question again, Chihiro.
Yeah, that's okay. The second one wasn't really a question. I meant to send it as two separate things. Okay. It was when you were talking about the value of comparing like SSHRC and NSERC submissions. And so I just thought that could be a helpful paper to look at their practices. So that's more for info.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks. So our next question is from Eric. Have you also looked at how researchers in the federal government are sharing data, particularly outside of NRC and StatsCan?
So no, not currently. We've really just honed in entirely on CIHR, but I do see a lot of value in doing that. And if someone has the capacity or interest to do that, I would highly recommend it.
Do you have any follow-up questions, Eric? I've given you the ability to unmute if you wish.
Thank you for your that's what I expected, because it would be challenging to look at all the different agencies, and there's so many different names to use as search terms. Yeah. But it's something that I've been interested in because we're a smaller institute and it's not obvious where we should be submitting our data in a repository.
Yeah. Yeah, it's challenging, and you could look. So one thing we were interested in looking at, because some of the data availability statements will say the data is not available to be publicly shared currently, but could be requested through StatsCan or through NRC. And you're welcome to take a look at the raw data we have to see if any of those terms or any of those agencies pop up in the availability statements. That's all free and available to download. So please go ahead and knock yourself out.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
And our next question, how would you allow access? Would you strip any personal, et cetera, from the data? I'm a little unclear here, sorry. The federal government, in response to another poster, we use the Open Government portal, amongst others. So how would you allow access for restricted data, I think is the question there.
Yeah, so I think that really that's where the researcher comes into play. So I think the role of the library and potentially Portage and FRDR is to really focus on bringing to light what that data is and how to gain access. So to me, I see the researcher, depending on the sensitivity of the data and whether they have community advisory boards, need to come to some decision as to how someone would gain access to the data, which a lot of people already have that. But the problem is that it's not being communicated or shared alongside a record of what the data set is. So envision you go into FRDR and you limit your search to restricted data, and you only see data sets that may have the title, the description of what that data set is, maybe the participants that were included in that data set, and then a series of access instructions dictated or guided by either the institution, the governing body, or the researcher that would clearly articulate how, if I, a researcher interested in this data set, would go about step by step accessing that data and what I would be able to do with that data if I did get access. So that's the way I'm envisioning it. It wouldn't necessarily be libraries or Portage deciding on how access is provided, but their responsibility or our responsibility is to make sure people know that this data exists. So that's really where I feel most strongly, is that this data has value, but nobody knows that it's there. And how do we actually make sure that people do know that it is and can be accessed if possible?
Thank you. So our next question is from Christina, just asking if we'll be able to share the resources. So I do want to share that we will be passing along the recording as well as the slides, and there will also be a Q&A document that'll be circulated as well, I'm sure, with any additional information that you might find helpful. Our next question is, did you assess the completeness of the data sharing in the articles that did share data? Did they just share the main data set?
Yeah, so a lot of the times looking at the data set is what we looked at specifically was where it was deposited, right? So if it's in a repository, we looked in the repository to see if it was there. They said it was in the supplementary file, we looked to see if it was there. And then we just tracked what other information they included alongside that data set. So that's where this, if I can go back a couple slides, where we found the information that was provided alongside any of the articles. So this 354 is what was provided, whether data was shared in a repository, whether it was made available upon request or by application. This is all the information we got. So the figures and tables were provided, but beyond that, no. And on top of that, we have hesitated to go exclusively into the data in detail because there's a lot of different discipline-specific knowledge out there currently. And all of the articles we're looking at, some of them are biochemistry articles where articles are written almost in an entirely different language. And we didn't want to be the decider of saying, we think your data is accurate or not. What we wanted to say and figure out was there any data we could see and access, and what was accompanying that data? So we didn't want to make decisions about the completeness or the quality of the data just because we felt like we didn't have the expertise to do so.
Thank you very much. So we do have a number of related questions still open. Just being mindful.
Hold on, I just lost your audio there, Melanie, so I didn't hear what you said.
Sorry, I just wanted to check in to see if you're okay to continue answering questions.
Yeah, I would love to.
Okay, so we'll keep, but being mindful of the time, if you have to drop off the call, please feel free to do so. We know that we're going a little over time today. So our next question, do you see?
Oh, you're cutting out again, sorry.
Sorry about that. So the question is about additional steps or concerns when it comes to the wider discoverability of Indigenous data.
Yeah, so this is where I think the idea of OCAP comes into play a lot, right? So I do think there may be value, or I think the communities who are studied can decide whether or not they want their data to be discoverable or not, following ownership, control, access, and possession. So making data discoverable, if it improves the quality and the community who was studied decides it should be discoverable so others could use it, I think then that is wonderful, right? But if they feel like they don't want their data to be discoverable at all, then I think in that case, that should be totally justified. So I think that's an important consideration. And I think beyond Indigenous communities, anyone who's in a sensitive population being studied for health-related reasons should have a decision over what data is being shared and not. And that often comes up in the consent process, right? In the very beginning of the research project. So whether data is discoverable or not, I don't think if data can never be shared, then it shouldn't necessarily be discoverable. But if authors or researchers are willing to make their data available and the communities that they've studied support that, then it should still be discoverable, even if it's not readily open and grabbable on the internet, for example. So I think that's a really good point, but I think the communities who are studied should decide whether or not their data should be made discoverable for others to find, and related to ethics approval and approval of data sharing should be brought into that process at the very beginning. So thank you.
Thank you. And our next question, could we have a national Dataverse repository open to all Canadian researchers?
We could, right? And so my question, so we don't have a Dataverse instance at the University of Saskatchewan. And the repository piece is the one side of this, right? So it's possible, but you also wonder, is FRDR serving that purpose right now as that national data discovery service? My question is, how do you combine a repository like Dataverse or FRDR, which requires you store something in that repository, versus records or discoverability records of data that are restricted? So you may not have any data stored in a record, but you have a lot of metadata about what the data set is and how you gain access to it. So if Dataverse accommodates that, then that's great. But I think whatever national platform we think about, we need to consider how do we make sure we can represent both open data that can be downloaded, data that is restricted or licensed, and data that has information about how you would gain access to it. So I think it's possible, but whether or not that conflicts with what FRDR is, I'm not sure. I'd be curious to hear what others think about that.
This is Jeff here. We do have work proceeding on a national instance of Dataverse through OCL Scholars Portal. And as that progresses, I think it will be another national multidisciplinary repository option. And data deposited in the Dataverse at Scholars Portal and other Dataverses, that metadata from that data is being exposed through the search layer, the national search layer that is baked into FRDR.
Perfect. Great.
Thanks, Jeff. So our next question is, what steps can Portage or libraries take to educate research ethics boards about data sharing? The REBs give authors ample cover to botch data sharing.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think partnerships need to be established like sooner than later. So a lot of my role at NYU as lead of data discovery was, my responsibility was to develop working groups with REB, for example, and with research offices to help them understand what data discoverability would look like and how, whether they deposit their data publicly or whether they have it restricted, how it would feed into an institutional pipeline that would allow us, the library, to make sure that data was indexed. So that included talking about reporting guidelines in REB applications to make sure that the data was shared and documented accordingly. It was to bring out and have them think about where data was going to be deposited at the outset of the research project. And this isn't something that was easy, I will say. I would say it took us a few years to even get recognized by these groups in a close way at NYU. But near the end, before I left to come back to Canada, we had a really strong representation, and we're actually developing a research pipeline that as soon as an REB application was built, it included a data sharing piece that would be fed directly to our institutional data catalog. So I think what we need to do and what libraries need to think about is how do we get that integration and how do you start that relationship now? Because I think they're not necessarily a victim of doing it on purpose. I just don't think they're necessarily as informed as we are about the importance and value of doing this. And once you communicate it to them and also show that you can reduce the burden from the library side by taking on that role, which gives, again, the library a new opportunity, it's a wonderful way to get that relationship started and to improve data sharing on an institutional level as a whole. And that's just me speaking from my own experience, but I find that relationship building went a long way towards improving data discovery at our own institution. That's a great question, though. Thank you.
Thank you. So our next question is, do international collaborations help or hinder data sharing accessibility?
So that's a really good question. And I think they do both. So one of the things I didn't talk about, but we're looking at in this study is whether or not a CIHR study that is co-funded by the NIH, for example, or the Wellcome Trust, or the NHS, pardon me, in the UK, influences how data is shared and what's being included in that. So I don't know the answer to that. I don't have any evidence to support the answer to that, but I know with the GDPR, for example, that certain restrictions will definitely cause issues there, and that IRBs or REBs need to think about how data sharing will be impacted by the fact that some of it may not be available or permitted to be shared based on government or international restrictions. So I know that's not a great answer, but I do think it's something we're looking at, and we're hoping to see whether or not external funding does influence data sharing in some way or not.
So our next question, the idea of having the libraries take responsibility for indexing all data sets from our local researchers is brilliant. Wherever the data eventually gets deposited, the metadata can be standardized and can get into FRDR and be discoverable. How do you propose to fund this to be scalable?
Yeah, so the story of my life is finding sustainable funding for my crazy ideas. So part of me, that's where I wanted to go back to the idea of working with the tri-agencies directly. So because this is in their interest to make sure that researchers are complying with their policy and they can document that, I see potentially funding from the agencies to help support this across Canada, right? You have that funding coming in that provides support in order to help people comply with the data management plan. We get that indexing of information available and it gets put into repositories or made more discoverable that way. I also think it could be done at an institutional level. I think one thing that institutions should be thinking about is hiring librarians with expertise in this area who are interested in changing assignment of duties to improve the discovery of data. So I think thinking about positions like that held within the library who end up serving as relationship builders with other members of campus exclusively for the idea of data sharing is a really important aspect of that as well. So I think we're seeing that a bit in the States, at least I was before I left, where they're hiring people exclusively for this purpose. And I think institutions in Canada should be thinking about doing that. And I think we're seeing that here now as well. So the sustainability comes from ongoing concerted effort in doing it. But I think if the tri-agencies are expecting libraries and institutions to support researchers in this way, there should be funding to back that as well. And whether that's done directly to libraries or to institutional departments, or it's fed in through researchers who can pay someone to do that work, I think there's lots of different opportunities to think about it, but I think those are people who would be primarily responsible now. Excellent question, and I don't know the answer to that. If other people have ideas, I would love to hear them too, because that's the big question.
Thank you. I do have Wendy, you've raised your hand, so I've given you the ability to talk if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask a question.
I can't hear anybody. If somebody...
Yeah, I don't hear anything. So I'll give you a moment, Wendy. We'll do the next question, but if you do still have a question, feel free to let us know. You can either pop it into the Q&A or the chat. Our next question says, it seems to me that libraries might make headway on this issue by getting institutional buy-in through the academic senate and such to affect the campus-wide research culture. Are you seeing any examples of senate's involvement in the academic data lifecycle?
Yeah, so really good question. And I think a really important point that absolutely needs to be incorporated into this whole idea. I personally have not seen. If others on the call who are still here have, maybe I would love to hear that. But I do think a huge part of this, right, is currently I still don't think data is recognized in the way that it should be as part of the tenure and promotion cycle. We're still looking at publications and counts of publications. And the more we can do this and researchers can prove that their data is discoverable and available, I think the better chance that we can show the value of people requesting that data and having that data be transferred and be used for other projects. And how do we weight that against a publication? These are all big questions, but I absolutely think the academic senate needs to be involved in those discussions. And if they're driving the discussion, you better be sure that researchers will be much more happy to make their data discoverable than they are currently. Yeah. So a big piece.
Go ahead, Wendy, for your next question.
Okay, no, this one as well, because this is a big bugbear for everybody about promotion and tenure and so on. And I think this is probably going to be something that either the tri-councils are going to have to weigh into or NDRIO itself. Yeah. Because right now at my university, it's promotion and tenure is decided by the department. Not even the, and I mean, it has to go up through everybody else, but getting it there is decided by the department. And if you have a department that doesn't like data, you're kind of done.
Yeah.
Yes, so, and the other thing was that where I hadn't unmuted myself was about things like the Wellcome Trust. They also have the requirement that the data be saved. So that for sharing and for use. So you should be okay. You might have to make some arrangements about where it's going to be,
Mhm.
but not whether it's going to be.
Yeah, and I just think, someone goes to all that work and we're thinking, this policy is going to require researchers to do a lot of extra effort. And I've held focus groups with people around the policy at my institution, and a lot of them are saying, why? Why are they asking us to do this? Which was one of the impetuses for doing this project. And they said, if I put all this value and all this time into making my data as useful as possible, not only in good faith for transparency's sake, they want to be acknowledged for the fact that if someone else took their data and published 10 articles on it, their data should be weighted extremely highly because it resulted in more research that way. And
That's
so I
right.
think there's a discrepancy in what is the most valuable and what's not. And I think because a lot of people don't understand the value of what data can provide yet, it's partly, to me, it's the library's responsibility to communicate this because we're all here in this room talking about it, but it needs to be transmitted across institutions and done at a national level as well. So thanks, Wendy.
My background is a sociologist, and I think you also have to go after the academies.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you. And our next question is, what is the information seeking behavior for researchers when it comes to data? Do researchers discover a data set from journal articles, from professional contacts, or using a data search engine?
So what a wonderful question to ask.
You're very welcome, Kevin.
Yeah, so we did, I don't know the answer to that question, but I will say what we found, we were really surprised at NYU with our catalog, because most of our data was not discoverable elsewhere, that people all over the world were finding it. And a lot of them were finding it because our metadata was indexed in Google dataset search. So they're running a search in Google or Google dataset search, and that was a huge boon for the researchers at NYU. And one of the reasons that actually helped them contribute to this project more, because they're like, oh, if it's in Google, people will find it more, and I'm much more likely to put the time into investing in it. But what a wonderful research study for whoever asked that question in terms of the information seeking behavior of that, because I don't know how many of them look at the data availability statements and articles. And I think it's a great follow-up to what we're finding in this study. So good research question, whoever asked that.
Kevin, it's me here, Kevin at UBC in Vancouver.
Wow.
Yeah, I asked the question. So hey, go Bruins. Yeah, I deal with earth and ocean science, and nature is making a real push, part of Coptis, et cetera, to have data availability statements in their articles. But I'm kind of dealing with tri-council fatigue. I expect we'll be over COVID-19 before we hear from tri-council regarding an open access policy. So it's interesting times, and anyway, there we go.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's also something for further, I would love to see Portage look at too, right? Is who's searching in further, and how are they searching, and what's being done? And I think studies like that are going to go a long way to help us understand how Canadians specifically are looking for data, and whether or not there's value in how we develop these systems for people to use. And I think the same goes for institutional data repositories. Who's using them? I think looking at how the metrics of what we measure in terms of value and use of these tools is a really important thing to discuss. And I'm not sure if there's any working groups around that right now, if Jeff, you're still on the call, but the idea of how do we evaluate how these tools are being used and that they're actually valuable to people, I think is a really important question to ask.
Could you provide a link to that Google data, or that data set that people found using Google? I'd like to see how the metadata, et cetera, really encouraged the use of that particular data set.
Yeah, and so our developer at NYU back in the day, his name's Lamb, he still works there and he's amazing. He worked really hard to make sure Google was picking up almost all of our metadata, especially the accessibility work. So people knew right off the bat that it's available, but they might have to do some work to get it. So I'm happy to share that.
Thank you, Kevin. Anything to add to that, Jeff?
Well, the only thing I was going to say is the tri-agency policy is not an open access policy. It's rather a data management policy. And data should be managed well, documented, deposited, and made accessible as appropriate, which I think plays right into the message that Kevin's been giving throughout this entire webinar, that data, wherever it fits on the accessibility spectrum, needs to be discoverable. And so that's all I have to say there.
Well, and just to follow up on that, the tri-agency policy right now, you're right, is an open access. It's a deposit and management policy, but then you have this whole roadmap of open science, which is suggesting even more than that. So that's really where I was like, okay, this needs to be figured out. Like we need to have this discussion. So yeah, I appreciate everyone weighing in today.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And we have our final question from Ethel. So they're wondering if you have stumbled onto any raw data in humanities, and what would that look like? For example, collection of text and images. Is it applicable? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so have not encountered any humanities data, and I'll be the first to admit it's not in my wheelhouse. I've been very health sciences focused for a long time, but I have held focus groups with humanities researchers who, again, I think the first issue is don't think of what they do as data. And I think that's important because we should be speaking the language of the researchers we support, whether they call what they produce at the end of it or what they use to create an article data or not. I think we need to think about still making that available, not only for the sake of it being useful to somebody else, but for the sake of transparency and just the idea of an article gives us that tip of the iceberg look, right, of the summary of what someone did. But if I can learn from a humanities researcher how they took certain textual documents and how they interpreted them in a certain way in more detail that was accompanying their article, I think it would go a long way in terms of improving the trust of the research that's being done. But I haven't done any looking into that area. And again, that's sort of where my idea of, is it worth trying to see how humanities researchers have done this previously? So another really good question and lots of opportunities for us to explore going forward.
You can jump in, Ethel.
Oh, thank you very much, and I agree with you. It would be very interesting to see how the different methodology to work the text would be very rich. Thank you very much for your input.
Thanks, Ethel.
So that concludes our questions for today. And just, I wanted to give Kevin now a moment to wrap up if there's anything else that he'd like to conclude before we end today's webinar.
No, that's really it. We're going to share the slides, but if you have other thoughts about this, thank you for sticking on 20 minutes after the hour. You can email me anytime. This is sort of my main interest, so I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. And please check things out. And all the references I talked about today are here. So if you want to look for them, you're welcome to. So thank you all for your time and for attending today. And thanks for having me.
Thank you, Kevin, for being so generous with your time. And everyone that is still on the call, we will be following up with the slides as well as a recording and a supplemental Q&A document. So thank you, everyone. This now concludes our webinar.
Thanks very much, Kevin. Great job.
Thank you. Appreciate it.